The Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, is on a high-stakes diplomatic visit to France from the G7 Leaders Summit to a series of bilateral engagements. On the sidelines of the gathering, the Prime Minister is holding talks with world leaders. The spotlight is on Prime Minister's meeting with President Trump. Ahead of their scheduled bilateral talks, the two leaders shook hands at the G7 Leaders Summit. It was their first face-to-face meeting in the last 16 months. The two leaders are scheduled to hold bilateral talks tomorrow. The world has changed drastically since they last met. Tariff tirade, war in Iran, and eventual ceasefire in India-US trade deal. But most importantly, the meeting comes in the backdrop of tensions in the Strait of Hormuz. Indian sailors have faced repeated attacks in the strategic waterway as the US and Iran traded fire before reaching a ceasefire agreement. At least 7 Indian seafarers have been killed, while several others were injured during the conflict. In response, India summoned the U.S. Embassy's Deputy Chief of Mission, Jason Meeks, twice and registered its protest over the strikes. On the sidelines of the G7 summit, Prime Minister Narendra Modi held a bilateral meeting with Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney. The Prime Minister is also scheduled to hold bilateral meetings with UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer and UAE President Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan. Our Assistant Editor for Foreign Affairs, Sitan Subol, is in France and he sent us this report.
A moment that everyone was waiting for, the G7 family photo and of course the invited guests as well. And we saw how essentially Prime Minister Modi, the French President, the US President standing together, and at that moment, a moment that everyone was waiting for, the G7 family photo and of course the invited guests as well. And we saw how essentially Prime Minister Modi, the French President, the US President standing together. And at that moment, there was no conversation between the Indian Prime Minister and the US President. But we saw as soon as they went inside the plenary hall where we saw both were seated together, they had a brief conversation. In fact, this is the first in-person conversation between the two leaders in 16 months. Now, both the leaders will be having a sit-down bilateral meeting that will take place tomorrow at 6:30 p.m. Indian Standard Time here in France. And lots to unpack in many ways. The relationship hasn't been doing very well. We know that since Trump term 2, the relationship has essentially gone downhill in many ways. It's Donald Trump's insults, endorsing negative comments against India, the immigration issue, and of course what happened last week, the killing of Indian sailors off the coast of Oman. That of course has angered the entire country. So clearly there will be big focus on what could be termed as a reset if it happens after the two leaders meet. So the answerable for WION in France.